Well, welcome everybody, and good afternoon. We are delighted that so many of you have chosen to join us, and such a terrific group of folks, knowledgeable and sophisticated. This is going to be a terrific conversation. Looking out over the group of folks assembled, it really is a fine group. We have ambassadors here, we have senior diplomats, we have Ambassador Hills, we have many others who are real experts in the trade community. In fact, I kind of wish that you were up here and I was where you are so I could listen to what you have to say. But I hope that nonetheless the program will be sufficiently interesting and frankly cutting edge, that all of us will walk away today having learned something and perhaps putting some connections together that we might not otherwise have anticipated. My name's Eric Farnsworth. I am privileged to host the program today along with the Inter-American Development Bank and the Asian Development Bank, and to serve as the head of the Washington office of the Council of the Americas and the Americas Society. When people in Washington talk about the Pacific community, they're generally referring to U.S. relations with Asia and Oceania. On occasion, they include our immediate neighbors, Canada and Mexico, but only rarely is Pacific community a term that is used to encompass the broad sweep of Latin America as well. With our program today and our ongoing activities, Council of the Americas aims to change that. Because in our view, we can't speak meaningfully about the Pacific community without including Latin America. And given the dramatic economic growth and improvements that Latin America has made over the past decade, much of it related to trade and investment with Asia and Oceania, it's inaccurate even to try. At the same time, acknowledgement of the important role that a number of Latin American nations are playing in the greater Pacific economy would allow policymakers to leverage such activities into a broader strategy for hemisphere-wide trade and investment expansion, as the Council has urged for some time. The commodities trade that has been a key driver of regional growth for the past decade, particularly in South America, is likely to slow, and in fact is already slowing according to recent estimates by the IMF. Countries that have relied on exports of commodities to Asia will increasingly need to identify new engines of growth built on innovation, structural reforms, and productivity gains, among others. Such reforms, we believe, will be encouraged to the extent regional economies are more closely linked within the Pacific region, offering the best opportunities for the broad-based economic development that most regional leaders actively seek. Unfortunately, however, it's not entirely clear where the Pacific region trade and investment agenda is heading, or how it will ultimately impact the nations of Latin America. We see a number of initiatives, from APEC to the Trans-Pacific Partnership to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and others, each with different parties, ambitions, and timelines. We see potential regional partners like Colombia, Costa Rica, and Panama frozen out of negotiations they are keen to join. While 20 years after NAFTA, it took a strong push from the Council of the Americas and others, many around the room here today, just to include our top two export markets, Canada and Mexico, into the TPP negotiations. As the United States pivots to Asia, economic engagement is seen rightly as strategic opportunity. But here's the question. Given Latin America's growth over the past decade, contributing directly to global recovery, shouldn't we also be thinking in a similar manner about the nations to the south? That's why several of Latin America's most dynamic economies are actively working to build the Pacific Alliance as a new engine for economic growth and regional integration. Comprising Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Mexico, and shortly perhaps additional countries, the Pacific Alliance is rapidly emerging as an important economic bloc both in Latin America as well as in the broader Pacific community. It's an initiative that has developed organically and is already being seen as an important potential voice in the broader Pacific. The Asia-Pacific trade and investment architecture for the 21st century is being negotiated now. APEC will meet again in early October. The latest TPP negotiations have just concluded, and they included the latest party, Japan, and negotiators are working to have an agreement by the end of the year. So too with the Pacific Alliance. RCEP negotiations have also begun. Where do all of these initiatives leave the Western Hemisphere, including those countries participating in the negotiations, and those such as the nations of Central America, which have heretofore remained outside the process? How can the Pacific Community trade and investment agenda be pursued in a manner that will bring clarity, rather than confusion to trade and investment relations? How can Latin America position itself to take fullest advantage of the tremendous trade and investment opportunities that will present themselves once the agenda advances? And how can interested parties, including the United States and like-minded nations, best utilize the Pacific agenda to advance the hemispheric trade and investment discussions that, in my view, have largely languished for the past decade? These are the sort of strategic economic issues to which we seek to bring clarity this afternoon. We have a truly outstanding program with representatives from 3 governments at the center of these discussions. We also have representatives from the Inter-American Development Bank and the Asian Development Bank, who are collaborating partners with us today, as I mentioned earlier. And we have senior trade experts to discuss the issues at hand. And in addition to our speakers, I also want to thank IE Singapore for their support of the program today. And I also want to give a special note of thanks to Valeria Sousa Cruz, who has actively worked to pull this program together, and many others like it over the course of her work with us at the Council of the Americas. Ladies and gentlemen, I can think of nobody better to start our conversations this afternoon than our first speaker, Ambassador Mike Moore from New Zealand. Ambassador Moore, in my view, is as good as they come, and I know that all of you who have gotten to know him during his time here in Washington, as I have, appreciate his keen insight, his sound judgment, and his absolutely wicked sense of humor. For those who wonder what I mean, just have a look at the bio notes that accompany the program today, and I think you'll get a good sense of humor that the ambassador possesses. He's a former Prime Minister of New Zealand and has held numerous additional senior political positions, including Trade Minister and Foreign Minister, and of course he's also the former head of the World Trade Organization, where he oversaw the launch of the Doha Development Round. And for good measure, he's also a former Minister of New Zealand for the America's Cup. I got to tell you, for all the government ministries and government positions worldwide, that's the job that I would really want, Minister for the America's Cup. And I've been enjoying his tweets about the races as Teams New Zealand and USA compete right now, this week, for the Cup in San Francisco Bay. It's a real pleasure and it's a real privilege to welcome the ambassador back to the Council of the Americas to offer his thoughts on the emerging Pacific region trade and investment agenda. So ladies and gentlemen, to get us going this afternoon, please welcome with me the ambassador of New Zealand, Mike Moore.
Firstly, I want to pay tribute to Carla Hills, who's one of my heroes, and you all know Carla. And when she walks in the room, my heart sinks because I know I have to lift my play. And Jim, great to see you here again. Firstly, about this America's Cup thing. There's a race at 4 o'clock, and I'm going to be there watching it. You ought to watch this thing. These vessels are 16 stories tall. They're going at 90k. This is more about the space age than it is about stuff on the water. It's a remarkable thing. They call the sails wings. They don't call them sails. They hydroplane. You'll be seeing them skimming along, and all the guys aboard look like spacemen. It's space age technology. We're into a bit of a battle. Mind you, all these wings are built in New Zealand. We're very proud that we actually make more money out of super yachts than we do out of wine. But I suspect more of you have bought some wine than a super yacht. So it's going to be it's a fantastic operation. What have we learnt? We've learnt that we can beat Oracle, but we've learnt Oracle can beat us. And so there's no great technological advantage. Sometimes you get into these things, somebody's done something, they've got themselves 5k on you. That's not so as far as we know at the moment. Oracle, of course, have a secret weapon. They've got 30 New Zealanders on their squad. Limitless money. And Carla, I'll play the class card, the class warfare card. New Zealand wants to take this cup off the billionaires and bring it back to the ordinary, hard-working millionaires where it should be. And so we're going for it, and it means a lot to us, probably too much. Look, it's good for me to be here with friends from the Americas. I have a debt of honour to friends from the Americas at certain times in my life. People from Uruguay and elsewhere have always been there, and I certainly would not have been Director General without the friendship of friends from the region. Actually, all the Americas, if I might say so, eventually, although I think that's still a secret, eventually. And we certainly wouldn't have got Doha up in the configuration it was without the friendship and dedication of some serious ambassadors who are there at the moment. Anyway, I shan't go into many of their names. And of course, we have a new Director General. We were disappointed our guy didn't get there, but we're not dismayed because we know Roberto has added in his heart a central vision of agricultural reform and others that we share. What has been always good as a New Zealander is that when you're talking to friends from the Americas and friends from Africa, frequently your product mixes are the same. So if I'm speaking with a friend from Africa and he uses the word cotton, I say dairy, and then he says sugar, and I say sheep meat. And so, you know, we've been on the same page of history here. As a New Zealander, we're by nature naturally multilateralists. We always have been. It is a function of our distance and our history. Sometimes we're a bit idealistic about international institutions. We're at the League of Nations saying, fix up Manchuria, or at the League of Nations, fix up Abyssinia. In the 30s, we wanted to ban aerial warfare because it was a pretty bad idea. But we have had a deep conviction that multilateralism is the way to go. That I have written many good articles against regionalism and bilateralism and how this weakens the centre. That was some time ago. New Zealand only had one free trade agreement with Australia, and how hard is that? And on principle, we didn't quite like it, you know? But now we've got quite promiscuous, Carla. We'll do it with anyone. And so we've done a deal with ASEAN, we've done a very high quality deal with China, Hong Kong, as we say, Chinese Taipei. But this is a substitute for other things. And we're in at the beginning, as you know, Carla, P2 and P5 with TPP. So there it is. We're faced with certain propositions. And Carla, there are only two types of Americans, you're one of them, who understand that 95% of all the world's consumers live outside the United States, that 80% of the world's purchasing power and 92% of the world's economic growth is coming from outside the United States, that the middle class in Asia Pacific is going to treble. We grow from 525 million in 2009 to 1.75 billion in 2020. 159 millionaires every day created in China. So what do we do to hook ourselves into this? There are a number of deals underway. The most formidable and the ripest and the most ready to bank is TPP. That's where it is in terms of sequence. Now, nobody's doing this for air points. Our negotiators are in the air. Our serious people from all our countries are now working. Pizzas have been called out at night. We think Mr. Froman is a serious man who wants to do something of substance. And so there it is. We trust our leaders when they say elimination of all tariffs. We trust them when they say comprehensive, that we want to see a 21st century deal of the highest possible order, Carla. ISO 2000 deal. If we're going to compromise, if we're going to weaken, we can do that in Geneva or elsewhere. Let's invent APEC. And some of this is born of the frustration and disappointment of Geneva and also of APEC. The Bogor goals, free trade between developing countries by 2010, developing by 2020. I don't think we're going to make it. So now, frustration, I think our negotiators are extremely focused, and so are our ministers. To do it by the end of this year is a very ambitious goal. But I personally feel if we had another 3 more years, we'd still be at this point 3 months out. Unfortunately, it is the nature of negotiations. Some of these sick people actually enjoy it. It's taking it minute to midnight. But let's be ambitious. Let's not talk of exemptions. How could this thing fall over? It could fall over by house of cards pulling out one product here, one product there, and down she tumbles. Now, there are 21st century issues which are as serious as a heart attack and as complex as a heart attack. But they are extremely important to all of us. And some of them we're just getting on top of. Some of them we won't get on top of because technology is changing so rapidly. But data flows, big stuff, IP, serious stuff, and there is not always yet a consensus on some of these issues. On data flows, I must say that countries like New Zealand and the United States have some differences on issues of privacy. Free speech is even one. We believe in free speech, but some countries have hate speech. We disapprove of, but you can sell Nazi paraphernalia across the web. We deeply disapprove of it. Some countries ban it. So if we're going to set up an ISO 2000 standards setting operation, we have to be the ones, I think, because we're the ripest, to work this through. Now, and it's not going to get easier and given more time. And what has surprised me is how quickly, Carla, things have changed. I heard a figure from Mexicans, which that I use all the time, that for every dollar Mexico exports anywhere, 40% of that is an American input. And the content of American input in Mexico is so big that many of her free trade initiatives are compromised because there's too much domestic American product in it. We have to be able to handle that sort of thing. Here's one I just was shoved in front of me today. Canada and the United States, common motor vehicle industry, right? Parts flowing across all the time. For any one car to assemble, parts cross the border 6 times. So even our trade figures are now what we thought they were. So we can do the supply chain stuff. We can look at regulatory coherence. I can hardly pronounce it. I get so enraged at the costs we impose on ourselves because we can't sort these sort of things out. Cara and I were chatting before how for the big businesses, this is not really a problem. If Bill Gates is visiting, the president will meet him at the airport. But if it's a struggling small business and medium enterprise with 20 people in the backyard trying to give it a go, they need this. This is very much a small business opportunity. It's getting rid of this red tape and these contracts. Also, it's a good governance issue, that the more bureaucrats and paper we put in the way of a customer and a producer, the more the capacity for someone to rob and wreck the system for all of us. So how do we do that? We all, of course, think we have the best possible systems. And so it's, again, how we manage it, mutual recognition, highest possible standards all the way through. Now, you look at our group. Japan is the 3rd largest economy in the world. Nobody wants to see a flat Japan. It is in all our interests for every reason possible. We have successful, growing Japan. And we move to Vietnam, an economy in transition, gone through difficult times. These people, 90 million, are very keen to do something. They want to remodel their economy. Their ambassador is very bold in what he says. You know, we can do most of this, but we have to have something on textiles and footwear. And for heaven's sake, it is not dignified for a great nation to keep changing the definition of catfish. Then we move to Malaysia, an important country, wanting reform, wanting to be part of the global supply chain. Singapore, they're always smart and always 5 minutes ahead of everyone. Brunei, Australia, ourselves. And then we move into Peru, Chile, Mexico. This is a very profound group. Now, it has always been the view that the TPP should be a group of true believers who believe what they say. Elimination of all tariffs. These are huge words. And for some countries who want to join, we've said, if we conclude this, we'll be very disappointed because there's no time to go home. There has to be another tranche. There has to be more countries coming in. Of course the thing should always be expanding. How can you look anyone in Southeast Asia in the face and say they shouldn't be part of this? But it's what is ripe, what is bankable, then move on. And in parallel, come on, to say there's no time. America has been talking to the Japanese for a couple of years about this. Give me a break. We're all talking to other people. It is where the timing is right, where it's ripe enough, where countries can domestically live up to it. And we all know that the toughest negotiations are not between each other, but domestically of how we handle it. So I can see another tranche coming through of very close friends from the region. We've had interest from countries that aren't Asia Pacific, actually. Hard to say some shouldn't be interested in living up to these standards. However, it's, when you're acceding to the WTO and working with China, clever Chinese Taipei didn't wait to join the World Trade Organization. She adopted the rules, the procedures, the standards anyway. So Chinese Taipei's membership of the WTO was extremely easy to do. Other countries can start the internal reforms necessary to do this. Then we move across to this, the Pacific Alliance. Fantastic. New Zealand is an eager observer. What I could see happening, and please, I'm only an ambassador. I've got to sign them officers. Remember, you're only the ambassador. I don't want this to be misunderstood. That there will at one point, I hope, be a great convergence. That we can bank a no exclusions, comprehensive TPP. We can be negotiating to extend it, and then there could be a convergence. The RCEP deal, this is very important too. I'm not believing there's going to be breakthroughs at dawn, but I think it's very important to have the intellectuals, the opinion makers, the bureaucrats in Delhi and Beijing and elsewhere thinking what this could mean, thinking of the costs of exclusion. Convergence eventually could be on the cards, and perhaps even more importantly, Carla, maybe we do TPP, we start expanding, the alliance is getting some muscle, knocking some doors open, knocking some barriers down, that eventually in a couple of years' time, Carla, somebody might rediscover the WTO. And that's the time you and I make our comeback. And we're in there, because that's what we actually want. So there it is. I've made the point as strongly as I can. Just one final point. If on some product lines we weaken, so let's get the deal, so let's knock away autos or rice or sugar or dairy or poultry or pork in Vietnam, we will pay a terrible price for this later. We need to face these things sooner or later, and the sooner the better. If we don't do it, when we go to expand it to other tranches, when we look at the great convergence, when we look at perhaps putting some gas in the tank of the Doha brand, we will regret this deeply. This will cost us a decade. So let's do it. It lines up for every reason, for governance reasons, for creating jobs in all our countries, for environmental reasons, because efficiency is conservation. It lines up. And of course, the cost of being an American is that America is in the front row always. Sorry about that, but that's the way it is. And America has provided that leadership in the past. I mean, all the generous things that America's offered the world in the last 50 years, of the United Nations, the WTO, MFN, one of the great generous gifts of statesmen and women. What a brilliant and generous idea. That generosity has been repaid many times. And if we show the leadership and the generosity again to those brothers and sisters of ours who are slightly poorer, who need slightly more time than we do, will be repaid, because we'll be talking about customers, citizens, and friends of the future. Thank you.
Well, now you know why we were so keen to get the ambassador here. What a terrific tour de force. Thank you. And he's got time for a couple questions. So to the extent that there may be questions, I don't know that we have circulating microphones. Perhaps we do. But if you can speak loud and project, there's a question in the back. We'll go with Susanna, and then we'll go here. Maybe take these two questions together. Ambassador, let you handle them as you will, and then we'll, after this round, then we'll go to the first panel of presenters.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your very considered comments. My name is Susanna Flori, and I'm with the Pappas Corporation. And I was just curious, how come you did not mention anything about Indonesia?
The question was, why did I mention Indonesia? Because I'm stupid. I should have mentioned Indonesia. When I was thinking the second tranche, I'm thinking Indonesia. And I'm thinking other countries. But at their pace, when they decide, if you're going to join this club, as our Minister says, there are certain dress codes, and this is not a question of imposing on others. People must be prepared to go to the highest possible standard. Of course, Indonesia, but every single one. These are our neighbours, of course, and others in there. I did not mention the Philippines. I did not mention South Korea. I mean, what an example to all of us the South Koreans have been for the last 20, 30 years. Fantastic result. But is it right, some product lines for them? At the moment, they're digesting what the American deal now, but how, wouldn't it be disappointing in 5 years' time if this wasn't all moving on? Of course, of course.
Hello, Ambassador. My name is Jose Polito from Mitsui & Co. Thank you. Hello? Hello?
I can hear you better without it.
Okay, that's fine. You're very careful to detail some exemptions that some Southeast Asian countries might want, but will the U.S. negotiators behave? Will the U.S. not ask for certain exemptions, like in the automotive industry? Thank you very much.
Look, it's a dangerous enough trying to speak for my own country, let alone America. We shall see. We hold people to their words, to their promise. Let's see. Now, when we say no exemptions, we don't mean, we're talking about sequencing. We're saying, look, if for a certain period of time, and we're not talking a generation, if for 5, 7 years you need to phase us out with quotas, with systems, I think we are, and our friends are flexible enough and smart enough to know that you just can't do this overnight, but it's not going to take longer than 5, 7, 8 years, I hope, various seasons to wind this through. So of course countries, and if they're rich enough to do it, they can do these adjustment programs if they so wish. But we shall see. But one person's exemption is another person's exemption. And then we know exactly what will happen. But it goes both ways. We need to be on target, and maybe we should, other friends talk about it. The implementation of this is going to be hard for some economies and transition and developing countries. And what broke my heart at the WTO was you could only get the capacity stuff up after you got other things up. Not for me to point to Europe as an example, because sure as hell not. But one thing the Europeans did do well in the expansion of the Union, when they brought in Spain and Portugal and Ireland, was put restructuring assistance directly in the middle of that. Of course, the Irish and Spanish and Portuguese have been very grateful, haven't they? But don't want it done for other new entries. The point I'm making is to capacity building up to assist some countries to implement agreements on IP. I mean, you have so many lawyers. I'm sure you can lend Vietnam 1,000 of them and no one would notice.
So, ladies and gentlemen, one more time, a round of applause for the ambassador, and then we'll get to Excuse me.
Rowena will put the apologies in that you didn't really mean it. Cheers.
So good afternoon. Thank you very much. Thanks, Eric, for the for the opportunity to organize this together. My name is Antoni Esteve de Ordal. I am the manager of the Integration and Trade Department at the Inter-American Development Bank. And also like to introduce my colleague, Masahiro Kawai, who is the Dean and the CEO of the Asian Development Bank Institute. It's a great opportunity because it's a way to share with you some of the collaboration that the two banks have been doing over the past few years. It's a collaboration that has been strengthened a lot precisely because of this relationship, that the strengthening relationship between Latin America and Asia. And what I will do today with Kawai-san is to give you a little bit of context that hopefully will serve for the panel discussion that you will have afterwards. This presentation is actually an updated presentation of joint work that we did last year. You have a copy of the book. It's almost one-year-old book. Things have happened very fast in the last year, so lots of the things that we say in the book are still valid, but lots of things are already a little bit outdated. So we did a little bit an effort to update some of the things that we did together in this project. I'll try to be very fast, just giving you a few stylized facts. We will divide this presentation between myself and Kawai-san. I'll just talk very briefly about the trade boom that these two regions have experienced in the last decade, as Eric was mentioning, a little bit about investment issues, and then Kawai-san will talk a little bit about the topic, kind of the more closer topic of this afternoon, which is this emerging new architecture in the Trans-Pacific. About the trade, this is something, the story that is well known, but when you see the dates, every time that you see the numbers, it's quite impressive what has happened in between these two regions. For almost 100 years, the share of Asia on Latin American trade was always less than 10%, very, very flat, very low. And suddenly, around 2000, you have this huge boom of trade between the two regions. Today, we have 20% of total trade of Latin America is with Asia. This just has happened in 10 years compared to this decade of more or less flat relationship between the two regions. Asia, as you know, is the second trading partner of the region after the United States, which is more or less 35% of total trade. And we have almost achieved the mark almost of the 500 billion total trade between the two regions last year. I'm not going to get into the details. You have the book, but this is something that you already know. This is a story about a few countries still. This is a trade structure that is very highly concentrated in a very few countries, in a few commodities, especially on the Latin American exports. This is mostly for Latin America, a story about commodity trade. Of course, it's a little bit different when you look at Asia. And it has created quite a lot of imbalances. The relationship of our region, Latin America with Asia, it depends on which country you live in. It's not the same thing if you live in Mexico, in Central America, or if you live in Brazil or Argentina. These are different stories of linking with this region. But behind these trends, this is very important when one looks at the future. This is a story about very basic comparative advantage between the two regions. This is a story about Latin America, which is relatively well endowed with natural endowments. This is the dot in red. Here we look basically the relative endowments in, measure of endowments in land, in water. Asia is a region, for most part, relatively weakly endowed in some of these commodities, and this is a fact that will stay probably for several years ahead. The type of trade structure that you can expect from this type of relationships is what we have seen in these two regions. It's a There's a huge trade deficit in Latin America with manufacturing over this past trade boom, and of course a trade surplus in commodities, in natural resources. Question here, of course, is going to be, and Eric raised this question, and this will, I think, will be maybe discussion later on, is how sustainable is this? You know, how long we can go with this type of dynamism? We will probably not see another boom of the same magnitude that we have in the last 10 years. Things have changed in the last few months, in the last year. The growth of emerging markets has slowed down. My belief is that there's some fundamental issues, some fundamental structure that will still remain. We will not see probably the same type of dynamics, but basic fundamentals still exist between the two regions, even with lower rates of growth in both. And I think this is a reason of why should we also still focus on how to eliminate the bottlenecks, the barriers, the frictions that these two regions still have. There has been this boom in trade, you just have seen it, but still we have a lot of tariffs in place. We have a lot of cost to trade between these two regions. I'm not going to get into the numbers, but there's still a huge room for liberalizing trade between the two regions on the most traditional aspects, which is just tariff liberalization. And this is the story about the architecture that we are trying to build between the two regions. There are other costs that were also referred at the beginning, which are also very important, that has to do with the distance that separates these two regions. The tariff levels between these two regions are as high as the logistical costs, the transportation costs. This is another area in which these two regions have a long way to go if we want to strengthen this type of linkages. And I think there's a reason, more of an urgent reason to develop this type of policies. Governments are acting, and this is what we have been seeing in the last 10 years. One way of working between the two regions is one way of reducing this type of friction is through these FTAs. If you look at the number of FTAs signed between Latin America and Asia, we have seen an average of almost 2 new FTAs every year for the last 10 years. By 2020, we may have in place around 30 FTAs between these two regions, bilateral agreements, or some of them transnational. Not everybody has gone at the same speed on this. There are more prolific countries than others in both regions, still very concentrated in very specific countries in both regions, the ones that are more active in these trans-Pacific linkages. And Kawai-san will refer to some of the further architecture that is emerging beyond this type of bilateral relationships. So the governments are proactive, some are more proactive than others, but there's still a work to do there. On investment, which is a little bit the other side of the coin, it's actually a good way to look at how we can easy some of these trade imbalances. The data is a little bit more tricky to look at this. We have in the book very detailed discussion looking whether it's this graph, for example, look at specific greenfield investments between Latin America and Asia, or Asia and Latin America. The magnitudes are sovereignly different. This is a story especially still about investments from Asia to Latin America, not yet the reverse. And it's a story about specific countries. Most of the investments from Asia into Latin America are into 2 major markets, Brazil and Mexico. And the first investors is, of course, Japan is still the major investor in our region. And the second is a little bit of a split between, even though we always look at the news, or we see in the news, China is one of the main protagonists. Korea is still a protagonist. It's a big presence in our region. India and others. The reverse relation, which is the investments of Latin America to Asia, much minor, very concentrated also in very few markets, especially the People's Republics of China, a little bit in India, and the main protagonist here is Brazil, followed by Mexico and Chile. The trends are pronounced in both cases. There has been really a movement of FDI. This is official data of FDI for 3 countries: Japan, People's Republics of China and Republic of Korea, with Latin America as a whole. This is where the good data is. The trends are quite impressive in both regions, but look at one big difference. The top one is in billions, the bottom up is in millions. The dimensions are still very far from one to another. So So I'm going to turn now to Kawai-san, who will basically take the presentation from here and discuss a little bit how we see the emerging trade architecture being played in between these two regions. Thank you.
My name is Masahiro Kawai. I am from ADB Institute in Tokyo. I'm very happy to talk about this issue with Tony. We have been working together, the ADB from Asia and IDB from Latin America. So I'd like to now talk about the emerging new regional and trans-Pacific trade architecture. Now, Latin American countries have been very active in forging FTAs. Active countries include Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico, and others. In Asia, FTAs were not so many in the year 2000, but Asian countries have been catching up. Singapore, very active, Japan, China, India. So the number of FTAs has been rising. But many challenges remain. In the case of Asia, now we have a total of 71 FTAs, and also many FTAs in Latin America. And clearly, FTAs have created huge benefits for both regions. Several challenges include how to increase the use of FTA preferences. Not all FTAs are used, and we are trying to understand why firms are not using FTAs. We find that the lack of information surprisingly plays a very important role. SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, they do not have significant capacity to cope with FTAs. So we have to encourage firms to use FTAs. The second is how to tackle the risk of spaghetti bowl or the noodle bowl in Asia. I'll come back to this. Third, how to promote comprehensive coverage of agricultural trade in FTAs. And fourth, how to facilitate services trade liberalization through FTAs. And then how to increase the so-called WTO plus elements, like investment liberalization, competition policy, procurement, and so forth. We have been working on how FTAs could be multilateralized. And we have been recommending to Asian countries from the ADB perspective, use WTO consistent provisions in FTAs, and making rules of origin multilateral friendly is a very important step. This includes rationalizing rules of origin or adopting co-equals for rules of origin, upgrading rules of origin administration, and harmonizing regional rules of origin across regional FTAs. And also consolidating bilateral and plurilateral FTAs in a region into a region-wide FTA would be also the way to go. And connecting with the rest of the world would also be important for Asia and Latin America. And improving business support for SMEs is another important challenge. In Latin America, new initiatives have been emerging. The Pacific Alliance, including Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, is a very important initiative. Its objective is to create an economic integration area with free flow of goods, services, capital, and people to boost regional competitiveness and strengthen relations with the Asia-Pacific countries. Market access liberalization agreement has been completed, and full tariff elimination immediately for 90% of products, and also members harmonized rules of origin. And comprehensive provisions, including services and investment, government procurement and standard are in place. There are other important progresses made for non-traditional disciplines, including trade facilitation, export and investment promotion, movement of persons across borders, cooperation beyond trade, and financial integration. I think from the Asian perspective, the Pacific Alliance is an extremely interesting initiative, and we are learning. In Asia, there are two competing or complementary processes. Some people call this competing. Other people, like myself, would call this complementary. One is the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, among the ASEAN 10 countries and plus 6 countries. China, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, New Zealand. And also there is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, among 12 countries. Ambassador Moore talked about this. There are differences between the two, and maybe the differences are huge. RCEP respects ASEAN as a center of this grouping. Also, RCEP would require a China, Japan, Korea FTA because there is no FTA among the 3 countries. That's a missing link. And this China, Japan, Korea FTA could be connected with the existing ASEAN plus 1 FTAs. And TPP is not including China and may not include China for some time to come, whereas RCEP does include China and India, but does not include the US. And both RCEP and TPP are open to new members. Some South Asian countries have been asking us how they can join RCEP. TPP membership has been expanding, and maybe more members will be coming. And RCEP and TPP would be important building blocks for the APEC-wide FTA for the Asia Pacific. And some sort of convergence between the two would be needed over time. Now, RCEP and TPP, the difference is that the TPP tries to achieve a high degree of liberalization and openness. Therefore, only a limited number of countries can join. Countries like China, Indonesia, they are not ready India not ready. Of course, to become a TPP member, you have to be an APEC member, but India is not a member, but India may become an APEC member sometime in the future. But these countries are not ready, but these countries are ready to join RCEP, to negotiate RCEP. So our view is that developing countries that are ready to negotiate a lower level of liberalization and openness through RCEP. They can start with RCEP, and once they become more open and liberal, they can now join TPP. So RCEP is sort of a stepping stone towards TPP. And they would be, once again, very important building blocks for APEC free trade area. There are many opportunities and challenges. One important aspect of RCEP is that it includes many developing countries and low-income developing countries like Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia. So RCEP is an inclusive trade arrangement. TPP cannot be so inclusive. So here a lot of opportunities are created. Essentially, the RCEP can support the production networks and supply chains that have been developing in Asia. TPP can support the supply chains developing in the Asia-Pacific region. We have done several numerical exercises. Bigger the grouping, the better, bigger the benefit. So in Asia, there have been a discussion as to whether ASEAN plus 3 countries or ASEAN plus 6 countries should be forming a grouping. Now the agreement is ASEAN plus 6, which would generate a bigger benefit. Looking at the Asia-Pacific, TPP does not seem to generate a lot of gain, but RCEP does. Even though RCEP is not a very high-level liberalization group, simply because countries like China and India, their protection levels are very high. So their protection levels are going to come down significantly, even under RCEP. So there would be very large gain created by RCEP. And then combining the two, FTA, AP, would give us a very big gain. So I'll be wrapping up in a few minutes. Asia and Latin America can deepen cooperation, building on the trade and investment links, bilateral cooperation, cooperation through multilateral groupings like APEC, and cooperation in international fora. Many agendas can be explored, like infrastructure connectivity to promote trade and investment, behind the border policy issues, including trade facilitation, poverty reduction agenda, disaster response, climate change, financial regulation, and also global dialogue on the issues of mutual interest for Asia and Latin America. And regional multilateral institutions like ADB and IDB can support this cross-regional cooperation. And as a matter of fact, the presidents of ADB and IDB have signed agreements to support cooperation, including sustainable low-carbon transport, and also to share access to trade finance programs that link more than 100 financial institutions to support trade between the two regions. And the two banks are trying to encourage or facilitate exchanges of knowledge sharing among policymakers, academics, and business people on various issues. So, in conclusion, despite a substantial rise in Asia-Pacific trade and investment, trade is concentrated in a few countries, and on the export side, in a few commodities. And also Asia-LAC trade imbalances have developed. Cross-regional FDI has been growing, particularly on the Asian side, but still it's lagging behind trade. To promote more balanced and diversified relationship between the two regions and to promote cross-regional foreign direct investment, high trade costs and high barriers to trade and investment needs to be reduced. So bilateral or cross-regional FTAs or TPP would be a very good instrument. And mega regional FTAs like RCEP in Asia and the Pacific Alliance in Latin America can set conditions for a more ambitious cross-regional FTA like FTA AP. Economic recovery from the global financial crisis could be slow, putting constraints on Asia-LAC trade and investment. But the two regions can overcome this problem by deepening the relationship through FTAs and wider cooperation, including technological and development experiences or sharing such experiences and coordinating interests in the global forums. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, Tony and Dean Kawai, thank you very much for setting the table for us so comprehensively. That was, from my perspective, outstanding, and I trust from all of yours as well. Before we go to the panel, I would commend to you the book that they are referring to, just updated, and it's entitled Shaping the Future. It should be at all of your places. We really are shaping the future in the Asia-Pacific region. From the Council of the Americas perspective, we hope that includes a large percentage of Latin America. But nonetheless, we are shaping the future. And I think this book will prove to be, it's already proven to be, but it will continue to prove to be a real resource to all of us who are focused on the region. So again, I commend that to you. If I could have the panelists now for the second panel come up to the stage, and we'll get you mic'd up and we'll continue with the program. Thank you for your presence here as well. Well, okay, I trust everybody is mic'd up, so that means we're live. As they say in Washington, no mic is actually not live, so be careful what you say. You get yourself into trouble. But we all anticipate, nonetheless, that we are on the record right now. So I want to begin the conversation, or continue the conversation, actually, with the contributions from the government and embassy of Japan. For those of you who have followed these issues for a long time, as have previously been discussed, Japan has been a major player in the Western Hemisphere for many, many years. But in the context of TPP and in the context of some of the trade architecture, is perhaps a relative newcomer to the table. So perhaps we can start with our first speaker. And you have all of their bios with you, but so I'm not going to take the time to introduce them, although each of their backgrounds is extraordinarily impressive. But Yasushi Akahoshi is the economics minister at the Embassy of Japan, and he has joined us today. And I'd like him to just offer his thoughts in terms of the regional economic architecture that we've been talking about from Japan's perspective, with reference to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the negotiations there, perhaps how you're viewing the Pacific Alliance, and other topics according to how you're viewing those. And then we'll go from there to our embassy representative from Mexico, who's a good friend of the Council of the Americas and certainly somebody who has been with us before, Antonio Ortiz-Mena, for his comments. And then we will continue the conversation with Congressman, Ambassador, whichever title you have, about 15, Jim Backus, who is also a great friend of the Council, for his comments. So why don't we start in the middle, and we'll continue the conversation. Okay. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Eric, for your kind introduction. And actually, I'm a little bit embarrassed to talk just after the thorough presentation of two experts, but I'll try to do my best, and I'll try to be very brief. And before entering into the topics, I'd like to express our appreciation for your support to Tokyo as a host of 2020 Olympics. And I believe that passing the torch from Brazil in 2016 to Tokyo 2020 is somehow fits today's topics. Thank you. So I'd like to talk about two issues from the perspective of Japan. The first one is Japan's participation in regional economic architecture building in East Asia in the past, and it will be followed by some ideas for its future direction in Asia Pacific. Let me begin with my first topic, touching upon my own personal experience, because I believe it somehow reflects on that. My previous overseas posting was in Singapore from 2004 to 2007, and my assignment there was to cover not only Singapore, but whole ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations countries as a whole. During that period, we discussed the possibility of regional community building in East Asia, which put ASEAN as a hub. You may ask why ASEAN should have been the hub. ASEAN has annually invited leaders of surrounding countries, including Japan, Korea, and China, and it has provided good opportunities to discuss such issues. Based on the discussion, the idea of the East Asian Summit, which consists at that time, which consists of ASEAN plus 6, namely Japan, China, Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand, emerged and was realized in 2005 in Malaysia. At that time, as for free trade agreement, Japan had concluded our first one with Singapore and aimed for the conclusion of Japan and ASEAN FTA as a regional economic integration. As a matter of fact, a lot of Japanese firms had a long history of direct investment and manufacturing in various countries in ASEAN, such as Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand. Furthermore, when I was stationed there, a cross-border production network had been formulated. For example, manufacturing firm A produced parts in country X and assembled final products in country Y. So in that sense, Japan-ASEAN FTA was supposed to support such real business activities by the institutions. In the meantime, China, Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand were also pursuing FTAs with ASEAN. They were concluded in several years. And now we are negotiating FTAs which would combine these FTAs as RCEP, as Dr. Kawai has just mentioned. During the period when I was in Singapore, Japan concluded the FTA with Mexico. The motivation for Japan was quite simple under our fear of falling behind NAFTA and EU-Mexico FTAs. It really strengthens the economic ties between both countries. That said, that was not something regarded as regional economic integration. So these were the movements which took place on the west side of the Pacific, which I observed and took place from Singapore. As a matter of fact, there were arguments on how to link both sides of the Pacific, such as possible participation by the United States in the East Asian Summit, or a negotiation of the so-called P4. Japan negotiated and concluded FTAs with Chile and Peru after Mexico, and we are negotiating with Colombia right now. They are definitely beneficial, however, they are purely independent and bilateral. So much for the first half, so let's move on the latter half. Now we are observing the emerging momentum toward regional economic integration in Asia-Pacific. In other words, on both sides of the Pacific. The greatest initiative is TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. Japan formally joined the negotiation last July and is working hard to conclude the negotiation. Since 12 countries on both sides of the Asia-Pacific are participating, it's an initiative moving toward an economically integrated area, not just coexisting partnerships. And another idea we have in mind is to deepen our ties with the Pacific Alliance. Actually, Japan got observer status with the alliance in last January. As I mentioned earlier, Japan concluded 3 FTAs with countries in Latin America, and 1 is ongoing, but they are still literally bilateral. We are still in the brainstorming stage, but we are wondering if we could take advantage of the presence of the Pacific Alliance and conduct a similar approach as we have been doing with ASEAN. A key word would be connectivity. In ASEAN, we have been cooperating with relevant countries toward building and improving infrastructure. If that would be the case, we can realize an increase and improved flow of the supply chain in addition to the effect of FTAs. If we take Colombia as an example, if a port along the Pacific coast, which is rather small compared to the ports in the Caribbean, is enhanced and improved, it will promote trade and investment with Japan and other Asian countries. So let me conclude in this way. Economic integration in East Asia has been widespread across the region, while economic ties connecting both sides of the Pacific has been rather bilateral. Now, I think there is a motivation toward real regional economic integration in the Asia-Pacific as a whole. We'd like to cooperate in various ways to realize that goal. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And I am impressed by the way that you linked not just the trade negotiations and FTAs, but also the idea of economic integration, which you made a distinction between. And I think that's very important. And turning to the strategy of the Mexican government, this has really formed a real function of Mexico's own economic development strategy, has it not, Tony? The idea of outreach to the global community and trade. You know, the governments, the current one and also previous ones, have been very aggressive. Tell us a little bit about that in the context of how you all are seeing the Asia-Pacific community as a real driver of your own development and economic growth.
Yes, thank you, Eric, and thank you for the invitation. First, more of a personal comment. I believe that if in Mexico some years ago you mentioned the Pacific, most people would think of the Asia Pacific. They'd sort of, even in Mexico, would tend to forget about Latin America. Even, for example, this event is sponsored by the Council of the Americas. But the Americas was sort of not in the radar. Second example, I'm a graduate of the University of California, San Diego, where they have the Center for International Relations and Pacific Studies, IRPS. And of course, everyone knows that it focuses on the Asia Pacific. They tend to forget about the Americas. So I just want to underscore that point. I'm sure you won't be upset, but I think there's still more work to do, thinking about both sides of the Pacific, not just the Asian side. That being said, I would like to give some comments on the TPP and on the Alliance of the Pacific. as Ambassador Moore said, the TPP is a very ambitious and very comprehensive agreement. And when we decided to join the negotiations, we were very much aware of that it's a high commitment agreement, and we are earnestly engaged in the negotiations. We believe it's critically important to address issues that have not advanced a great deal at the multilateral level, and it is also addressing a whole host of new topics. We know that the TPP will not be closed to new members, so it'll be a very, very important piece of the 21st century architecture for trade and related issues. So it's very important for Mexico as an open economy with a very large network of trade agreements to participate in the TPP. From a defensive perspective, you could say, well, it's to avoid preference erosion, but it's also to constructively engage in crafting the rules of trade for the 21st century. So this is a strategic view. Market access is important for us. We have one agreement with Japan that was already mentioned. It was upgraded fairly recently, but there's a big potential in terms of market access. But I would say it's at least as important the fact that we have a voice in crafting those rules. So it's not only about market access, but about the rules of the game. Also very important for us is the fact that Canada and the US are also participating in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. It's an honor to have Ambassador Hills here, because it will be NAFTA's 20th birthday next January of its entry into force. It was really a path-breaking agreement at the time. A lot of people thought it couldn't be done between a developing and two developed countries. It was path-breaking because of its scope and coverage. It had some coverage for services, but it has been 20 years. It has been 20 years. And given the very deep ties that exist between Mexico, the US, and Canada, it is important to make sure that we keep working to reduce transaction costs in a shared economic space in North America to keep facilitating trade and investment. The name of the game is not only tariffs, it's a lot of what Ambassador Moore mentioned about regulatory cooperation. It's about rules governing FDI, intellectual property rights, e-commerce, etc. Ambassador Moore was also kind enough to give some numbers about Mexico-US integration, but I would like to offer some other just to give a sense of how important this is for Mexico. So the US value added of US imports from Canada is 25%. That figure from Mexico is 40%. If we compare that to countries in other regions, it's about 4% for China, 3% for Brazil, 2% for the EU, and for Japan. So for Mexico, having a seamless integration of North America is extremely important, both for trade within the region and to promote North American exports to other regions. So I would say, this is the way we're looking at it. And some of the issues being covered by the TPP are issues we're also following at the domestic level. For example, deregulation, trade facilitation, IPR rules, support for SMEs so they can have a greater participation in international trade. So the TPP, in a way, dovetails with what we're doing domestically. It's a very, very, very important negotiation for us. Now, turning to the Pacific Alliance, the wide scope was already mentioned in the past PowerPoint presentation. But I would like to highlight a few issues in that regard. I see that as a common initiative by like-minded countries. I don't think we're being forced into that. We follow domestic policies that make sense to link these countries in trade agreements and to go beyond that. So we look at the world in similar in similar ways. There are, of course, traditional trade issues. The trade negotiations were concluded just a few weeks ago in Mexico, and I believe over 90%, between 90 and 92% of tariffs will be liberalized upon the entry into force. But we also have the suppression of visas, which has boosted tourism, both business and pleasure, between Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico. We're linking the stock exchanges. 3 stock exchanges are already linked. Mexico is working on that, so we're working very strongly on that. We're focusing on joining forces on scientific research, and we are even sharing embassies, for example, with Ghana. So this is way, way beyond trade. And this has elicited a lot of interest. I asked for information on the status of observers. It seems to be more difficult to get updated information on observers than on the trade negotiations, because this is an ongoing thing. So what I have as the latest as observers is Australia, Canada, China, Korea, Costa Rica, which is looking to join soon, Ecuador, El Salvador, Spain, the US, and you've written about that, France, Guatemala, Honduras, Japan, New Zealand, Panama, Paraguay, Portugal, the Dominican Republic, Turkey, and Uruguay, and 2 European countries have recently requested. So I think there must be something in it so that it's attracting so much interest. And I would end by saying that it's not only a very, very ambitious agreement, it's not a run-of-the-mill agreement, but perhaps the most striking fact about the Pacific Alliance is that we're actually doing what we say we will do. You know, we practice what we preach. We not only talk the talk, we walk the walk, and we're very, very proud of that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and count me as a supporter of what you're trying to do in the Pacific Alliance context. I think it's very exciting, and you're right, I have spoken and written about it, and probably will continue to do so a little bit, maybe even after today. All right, Jim, you've heard the comments from several folks already, some groundwork. You know, in terms of how people are viewing issues, the table has been set. But what we really haven't discussed at this point, and I'd love for you to touch on this, is where are we going with all this stuff? I mean, we talked about spaghetti bowls. We talked about other things. I'm not sure spaghetti bowl really works for the Latin America context. I'd like to suggest, instead of substitute, I'd like to suggest paella bowl. I think it works better in the Latin American context, except for Argentina, which of course is spaghetti. But the idea being that there are so many initiatives going forward, and in many ways for the best of intentions, but they're not necessarily consistent. They have different countries, they have different products, they have different phase-outs, and if you're a business person, and from the council perspective, we see this all the time, and you in private practice now see this, I'm sure, and others, this is complicated. You know, how do you work a global supply chain under 5 or 6 or 10 different trade regimes? And, you know, there are transaction costs, and so therefore the cost of business goes up. All these things we know so well. But in the Asia-Pacific context, and you having been serving at the WTO and from a global trade perspective, give us some ways to think about this, at least, to navigate through this. Where should we be going? Help us think it through.
The central question is the one you asked just now and also at the beginning of our session earlier this afternoon, which is, where are we going? And Mike Moore asked that question in a different way and gave us what he hoped was his answer, which is a great convergence in which, in the end, we'll be able to sort through all of these noble initiatives and make them consistent with the global trading system that is expanded and improved. And the alternative, if we don't have this great convergence, is one that no one seems to be writing about or talking about in Washington or elsewhere, which is a further fragmentation of a global trading system that We have worked for more than half a century to create and sustain and strengthen, and now to help survive and succeed. And no one seems to want to talk about that or say anything about that. That concerns me greatly. Let me preface what I'm about to say here by saying that when I was in the Congress, I was very much for the NAFTA. There wouldn't have been a NAFTA without Carla Hills, it must be acknowledged. But I supported the NAFTA, and I bled for the NAFTA, and I think we need more NAFTA and not less, which helps explain why I'm not running for office again. And I've never met a free trade agreement I wouldn't have voted for. I've supported them all. And if I were still in the Congress, I would be voting for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I would vote for the transatlantic deal. I think for the reasons Antonio has set out, and some more as well that he would have added if he'd had more time, the Pacific Alliance is really the most interesting initiative occurring anywhere in the world. It gets very little attention in the United States, but I think it's fascinating in any number of ways. One of the ways it's fascinating is this, from a legal perspective. It's a very practical effort that is intended to pursue economic goals without paying too much attention to politics. A lot of other regional initiatives get sidelined or sideswiped by politics. I won't bother to name any, but they're doing this in the right way. It's economic glue that's holding the Pacific Alliance together. How are they proceeding procedurally? They have what they call an early harvest. If they find an issue on which they agree, they just conclude an agreement, and they don't let the fact that they haven't agreed on other issues keep them from concluding what they've already agreed on. That works. Guess what? The WTO treaty allows the members of the WTO to do exactly the same thing. But they've chosen not to use that approach for the most part. And now no one's even bothering to mention that it's in the WTO treaty. It's a choice that's open to members of the WTO. It's perfectly possible that every one of these initiatives that's being concluded around the world, negotiated in every part of the world, could be negotiated and concluded as WTO agreements. But that's not even on the list of the options of how we pull these things together. We just heard a wonderful presentation about all the different ways we could combine all of these acronyms to make larger acronyms, but there was no mention about concluding them as plurilateral agreements under the WTO or moving them into the WTO later on. Every country involved in all of these negotiations is a WTO member. This could be done if the will were there to do so. Why would we want to do that? Well, Mike mentioned something else that's worth recalling. That is the gift of MFN. What is that? I don't know how many lawyers or economists there are in the room, so I'll take the time to explain it as I sometimes did privately to other members of Congress, and as I do it nowadays to law students. Let's assume that all of us are members of the WTO. We're all the individual countries. What is the most favored nation obligation? Does it mean that I give Antonio's country more favored treatment than I give to any of you? No, it means that I give to every one of you the same treatment that I give to the most favored nation, which of course would be Antonio. You know? Or if I make a concession to my colleague here to Japan, I have to make that same concession to everyone else. What does this accomplish? Well, in negotiations, as Carla can tell you, it improves the possibilities for trade-offs because you can get multiple nations involved. If you're a baseball fan, think of a three-team trade. It's the same kind of thing in terms of trade negotiations. But also, and more significantly, when any concession that's made has to be made to everyone, it lowers the barriers to trade significantly worldwide and multiplies the potential payoff economically from trade liberalization. So we get more bang for the buck. That's what most favored nation treatment is about. Now, it's important to understand that any time that you conclude a free trade agreement with some countries, you are by definition not doing so with others. So in discriminating in favor of some, you're discriminating against others. If all the countries involved in these negotiations are WTO members, how can they do that? Doesn't that violate the most favored nation principle that's at the heart of the trading system? Yes, it does. But in the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that's part of the WTO treaty, there's an exception. Article 24 that says you can do that if you have a customs union or if you have a free trade agreement. Well, great. What's a free trade agreement? Well, it says that a free trade agreement covers substantially all the trade between and among the countries involved in concluding that agreement. What does that mean? We don't know. We really don't want to know. Now, I can tell you, even though there is no case law on this, and I got out of Geneva alive after nearly a decade of judging cases without having to answer this question, but I can tell you the Pacific Alliance would satisfy the test. First of all, 92% is substantially all, and they've said they're going to cover the rest. Plus, as he described, most of what they're doing doesn't even relate to things that are covered by the WTO treaty. But what about the Trans-Pacific Partnership? What is it? Is it a customs union? No. Is it a free trade agreement? Does it cover substantially all of the trade between and among the dozen or so countries negotiating? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. We'll have to perhaps wait and see whether some country that's a member of the WTO that is not involved in these negotiations raises their hand in Geneva and says, I have a complaint because this violates the rules. What is the transatlantic deal that we're concluding? I don't know about that either. There's some things, investment, for example, that don't fall within the scope of the treaty to a great extent. But where it involves trade and non-tariff barriers to trade, that's clearly covered by the treaty. So the question then becomes, are we moving toward a great convergence? Or are we moving toward further fragmentation in which these blocks become just that? They become discriminatory barriers to trade with other countries instead of opportunities to lower barriers to trade worldwide. Again, I would vote for all of them because at this point we're at an impasse in the Doha round and in the WTO. Roberto Azevedo now has the reins there. He's already showing leadership. What we should be talking about is how we can use this momentum for trade liberalization worldwide to construct a great convergence. As Carla and I were discussing earlier, the NAFTA proved not only to be successful as an agreement in and of itself, but also it was a spur to encourage other countries finally to come to the table and conclude the Uruguay round. What we can hope for is that all of these initiatives that we're pursuing all over the world will be the same kind of inspiration, that they will be spurs, that they will provide us with momentum to conclude something globally and continue to sustain and strengthen the global trading system in which we've all invested so much. And one more point I have to add about the TPP. I would vote for it for no other reason than it gives every NAFTA member a chance to negotiate with other NAFTA members on continued and increased regional integration without having to utter the word NAFTA. And it's a backdoor way to do that that makes that negotiation worthwhile for that reason alone. Antonio said that much more diplomatically, but then he's a diplomat. So I would ask that we perhaps consider these issues in this broader context. And as a lawyer, I have to say, I'm making some legal points, but these are legal obligations that each of us as individual members of the WTO have to all other members of the WTO, including those with whom we are not negotiating regional agreements.
Well, thank you. There is a lot there, and you really added a lot to the conversation. Thank you for that. I only have one fairly significant criticism, however, and that's that you reminded us, who are Cubs fans, of baseball, and it hasn't been our year, so perhaps next year will be our year.
1908, I think. Is,
well, now you're really twisting the knife, so thanks a lot. But in all seriousness, what a tremendous intervention, so thank you for that. We are going to go to all of you to the extent that you've got questions and perhaps comments as well. We know that you probably do. But given the fact, and as you're formulating those questions, waiting for the microphone, given the fact that this is the Council of the Americas, I also have to ask the question to any of you who might care to briefly respond. You know, we've been talking about the Asia Pacific. We're leaving out a large number of countries in Latin America who perhaps don't have a geographic touch on the Pacific Ocean, or who haven't expressed interest, or who clearly aren't ready to participate in these types of initiatives, et cetera. Is there a way to use what's going on in the broader Asia Pacific in a positive way to bring along or encourage or to give impetus, build momentum for greater trade liberalization within Latin America itself? And I don't hesitate to add the Caribbean in there as well. We don't oftentimes talk about some of these issues, but we've been struggling a lot at the Council in terms of how do you leverage one into the other. And there might be a political reality here that some countries simply don't want to play the game. That's okay. These are sovereign countries. We understand that. But are there ways to assist countries maybe that want to play the game, that don't touch the Pacific, that are ready to take advantage of some of the initiatives but aren't members of APEC, or would like to replicate or advance along the lines of the Pacific Alliance, which we've all spoken glowingly about? I don't know, Tony, perhaps you'd like to give some thoughts and then come down this way to the extent people have comments.
Yes.
Tony first.
Yeah,
sure.
Yes, a couple of thoughts on that. Of course, you know, different countries follow different paths, and they're absolutely free to do so. And there's no one size fits all at all. I would say the following. Mexico has a large network of trade agreements. So beyond the Pacific Alliance, we also have agreements with the Central American countries, and those agreements were recently updated, upgraded, simplified. A key component is always the accumulation of rules of origin. So I think that's key. A couple of items that I think are very, very important and need not be necessarily addressed through trade negotiations are regulatory cooperation. Some countries can undertake unilateral regulatory simplification. You know, you don't have to negotiate everything. You know, you can actually do radical stuff like saying, I'm going to do it on my own because it benefits me. But you know, there seems to be a trap that if you don't negotiate, you don't do it. Sometimes politically that's a necessity, but it need not always be the case. The same goes for trade facilitation. I can't, you know, say enough about the importance of trade facilitation, simplification of customs procedures. Mexico has an electronic single window for foreign trade that, you know, that benefits a lot of traders. And I would finally also highlight the issue of infrastructure, just physical infrastructure. You could have, you know, an excellent trade agreement that, you know, reduces tariffs to zero in a short time. You can have agreements on regulatory cooperation, et cetera. But if you don't have the adequate infrastructure, you know, roads, railroads, ports, airports, to allow trade and investment to grow, you will hit bottlenecks. This is an, you know, obvious point, but I think not necessarily underscored. And again, countries can do that on their own. And you know, in a best case scenario, they actually, you know, talk to hopefully their neighbor and say, you know, let's think regional and see how we can work together to again reduce transaction costs, not only through, you know, legal agreements, but also through, you know, the building of physical infrastructure.
I think those are very important points. Appreciate you making them. I'm reminded of when the United States was in the process of negotiating a bilateral free trade agreement with Chile, and the process was taking way too long by everybody's acknowledgement. And the Chileans just got tired of waiting, and they said, okay, we already have low tariff rates. We're just going to unilaterally reduce them even further. Why? We could have waited for the negotiation to be concluded, but it's good for us. It's good for Chileans, and we're going to do that. It's an example that I think you're referring to, maybe not specifically, but the idea that countries can take steps in their own interests that bring them more in line with some of these ongoing trade negotiations in parallel. Yasushi, perhaps you have some thoughts or comments on this topic as well.
Yes, naturally we have deep business relationship with countries such as Brazil, and we have had cooperation in energy sector with countries like Venezuela. But all of them have been rather bilateral, as I mentioned in my presentation for other countries in the past. But let me take Brazil as an example. And again, there are a lot of Japanese business present there, and they are doing well, but they still have some complaint regarding their scheme or infrastructure or regulatory kind of thing, just as Tony mentioned. So we have had semi-annual dialogue between private sector and the government of both countries, which aim to promote trade and investment in both countries, and where we are aiming the improving the business environment in both countries. They also have some complaint on Japanese business environment. So maybe I would like to continue such bilateral discussion, not only with business, but Brazil, but also with other countries. And on the other hand, as I mentioned in my short remarks, we are trying to deepen our contact with Pacific Alliance, and actually I don't have clear image at this moment, but in the near future, I hope there is some convergence what we are doing with Pacific Alliance and what we are doing with countries like Brazil, or Venezuela, or Argentina. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. Jim, a quick comment, and then we'll go to the audience.
Well, first of all, I agree with all my two colleagues have just said. In particular, as Antonio said, inadequate infrastructure amounts to a non-barrier to trade, and it's an increasingly significant one, especially in developing countries. Also, I was struck by the notion of lowering barriers to trade unilaterally. Almost any economist would say, of course, this is a good idea. I think Frederick Bastiat in the 19th century put it this way. He said, there's no reason why we should put rocks in our harbor just because someone else does. But anyone who's run for office knows that we need to have trade concessions.
It tends to be a problem.
Lowering barriers to trade is a concession, and you need to get a concession in return. And there, I just want to elaborate on what I said earlier about the potential of doing these things within the WTO, because it could avoid some of the challenges that we face in the way that we're doing them now. For example, one of the challenges facing the TPP is, what about China? Will China participate? Well, China can't participate unless all the other negotiating countries agree that China can. So this could be a political problem. Japan's now involved, but they had to go through a domestic political process before they could get involved. If that negotiation had been pursued under the WTO as a plurilateral agreement, China would have an automatic right to participate if it wished. It could sign on to the agreement if it agreed to make the same concessions. It would be WTO plus. Japan would not have had to go through that domestic political process. You wouldn't have had to write so many memos. And Japan would have had an automatic right to participate if it chose. That's how it works with plurilateral agreements in the WTO, such as the Government Procurement Agreement or the Information Technology Agreement. They save political problems. Also, I have to add, there's an experienced and proven and reliable dispute settlement system within the WTO. And you can agree in a plurilateral agreement that's part of the WTO treaty to have that agreement subject to WTO dispute settlement. What if you have a dispute in some of these other fora, in some of these other places after you conclude these agreements? Well, you're going to have to reinvent the dispute settlement wheel. And will there be the kind of leverage that exists under the WTO through the withdrawal of these supposed so-called concessions as a last resort to encourage countries to comply with their obligations? Again, my concern is no one's even asking these questions, much less answering them. So I feel duty-bound, since I have WTO written on my forehead forever, to raise them, especially in this city.
Well said, well stated. Let's take a round of three. We'll start with Arturo here. And then if the question is for somebody in particular, please feel free to direct it to the person. If it's for the panel, please also suggest you. Right here.
Hi, I'm Arturo Porzekanski with American University. Yes, picking up on your last comments, Councilor Backus, I was wondering, one of the good things about the WTO, but also one of the bad things about the WTO is that it ring-fenced, to a large extent, agriculture, and it also ring-fenced a lot of sensitive industries via anti-dumping provisions. So
I'm sorry, what's the verb you're using?
It ring-fenced.
Ring-fenced?
Ring-fenced sensitive industries via steel and so on, via anti-dumping provisions that were used as a weapon to keep imports out. So I was just wondering, as those of you who are involved in TPP or are watching from the side, whether you see that any of these two areas, whether the ability to protect agriculture, be it American or Japanese rice or anything else, or else to lower the volume on anti-dumping weapon, you see that emerging as part of the TPP, or it remains some of those questions that are unanswered?
Well, I'll answer and then let them disagree.
Jim, let's take a round of three. Yeah, I think it's probably, we've only got about 20 minutes left, so we're going to go here to the ambassador in the front row. And then we'll collect them and
good idea.
Do it that way. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for inviting us. Well, my question, the point I want to make to you, is about the consequences. So far, the negotiation is going on. We support free trade agreement because we have one in Central America and Dominican Republic with the United States, and will be cynical to accept for us and not for others. That is clear. But we have to look for the consequences. And the basic problem that we have at this moment is the question of textiles, and basically it's with Vietnam. We understand that the strategic objective of the United States with this PTT is to create a sort of barrier, economic contains barrier to China. That's why they are not part, and they are not going to be part of that. But anyway, but in the discussion, first, the rule of jump forward that has been the basic rule of the United States for any other treaty, and we have that rule, yeah, for us is completely being banned with the exception of insufficient supply. The United States has offered the Vietnamese more than 230 exceptions to that rule, but are not exceptions like we have, because we have the same rule of exception, but we have the exception if we need it, and if we abuse anyone in the treaty could point that to us, and then my company will have to pay a hefty fine and all the taxes. For Vietnam, it's a clause. That means by decree of the treaty, there are short supply of that list. By the way, Vietnam has said that this is not even the 10% that we needed. But this is one point that will put us completely in a disadvantage. And the second one that is the worst, because the offer that the United States has made to Vietnam on textiles for access to market, divide in three baskets the products, lower, medium, and high, that they want to give higher protection to their own products. But in the first, it's zero tariff from the moment that the treaty starts to work. In the second, is 25% at the moment of the treaty, and in 5 years to zero tariff. And in the third, is 25% at the moment of the started to work in effect the treaty, and then in 10 and 15 years the whole thing. The problem is that if you lower 25% the tax, given the taxes that Vietnam is paying now between 30 and 34% for their garments into the US market, then that will translate in something between 4 and 5% in the cost of production, the price. And that will completely enough incentive for the companies to go to Vietnam, because the subsidies, because the laws about workers and everything, and because Vietnam is the recipe of all the yarns that come from the United States, from China. In that sense, the question is, has in this treaty considered the effect that they are going to have in the other treaty, that is our treaty with the United States? We understand that Central American countries, our country, has to move to a different thing in a period of time. But if you start to giving them 4 or 6% lower the price, in 3 years, all the companies are going to go to Vietnam because they are going to make more money there, and that is the way they do it. And then we are going to be destroying our industry that we have created as one cluster with the United States due to the free trade agreement, the CAFTA, right? But secondly, we are going to lose between Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador more than 1,000 jobs. Don't talk in the United States about immigration if you are going to live without work 1,100 people over there, right? And the social effect in our countries is going to be tremendous. And in 3 years, you are not going to change to a complete thing. See? That is the sort of thing that worries us about the way the United States is behaving. It still has not been approved. But if the United States make that sort of offer to Vietnam, the only thing that we could expect that they are going to be even lower the standard than they are now. Has been that considered? And not only for Central America, for Colombia as well.
Well, these are critically important questions. Ambassador Zamora is from El Salvador, and it's specifically why in my comments at the very beginning I raised the idea of there are countries in this process and there are countries outside of the process, and explicitly Central America is part of that process, and there are some real issues here. Hopefully we can get to some of them. Let's take the third question, if there is one, in the back here, and then we'll go to the panel, and I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the ambassador as well. So let's go here.
Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. Great panel, and the views, even the views from the audience are quite interesting to put everything together. Inside U.S. trade, I must say, we had a great issue this week. I don't have a chance to look at it, but
were you quoted, Steve? It must have been.
I was quoted on my 50th anniversary by the other periodical. But having said that, Inside we had a great page, and it was about 24 of the 34 pages, small, single print, not able to be read by seniors and so on, but really small print, but all about the TPP. So I highly recommend that as a background document and so on, etc. My question is very short. They made the point in the article that many countries, and they highlighted the U.S. and Japan, are beginning to now focus on the difference between the desire to open up markets, end up with much more liberal non-tariff measures, you know, the competition policy, SOEs, et cetera, SPS, and the fact now that many countries are now getting a defensive interest is showing up. All of a sudden, the agriculture community, some are getting very concerned about whether we really want to have our SPS measures subject to the famous WTO dispute settlement. A lot of the environmental groups are coming in. Are you guys beginning to see that within your own countries or within people who are observers, a certain reluctance maybe to move ahead too much in terms of this non-tariff liberalization? And then the second question, which never gets the right answer, but I never hear it, is everybody says market access is not that important, and yet we always end up focusing on it. Are there going to be some growth products for your specific countries that are going to come out of this negotiation where you can actually say, hey, I'm able to get 5–10% more growth? Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we'll take as the final question Ambassador here, Ambassador Hills.
Well, let me say that I thought that the presentations were absolutely fabulous, and I'm so glad that you're doing this. I'm a fervent believer in multilateralism. On the other hand, I think that any of the three agreements that you mentioned, transatlantic, trans-Pacific, or the Pacific Alliance, have competitive liberalization virtue. And if we get any one of them done, I think we would resuscitate Doha. Jim is absolutely right that we ought to plant these agreements in the WTO, but it isn't going to happen. And my question is, how are we going to get our respective political leaders to sanction bringing in new parties, keeping the door open? It hasn't even been announced on either the Atlantic or the Pacific Agreement that it would be and how it would be kept open. And this, I think, is a real problem. If we could get it in the WTO, I still worry. We have more than 300 bilateral agreements, some of which are very low quality. And although the WTO has the responsibility to evaluate these, they have neither the staff nor the intention of doing so. So I don't think that the WTO path...
I've evaluated one.
You've made my point. And so how do we keep it open? We cannot have the two largest economies, China and the United States, not in the same trade agreement.
Yeah, Steve, you hit the nail on the head. You said that the contributions of the audience were very additive in terms of the subject matter as well, and I would certainly concur with that. All 4 questions outstanding. None of the topics easy. We have agriculture and anti-dumping. We have textiles and how it relates to Central America, trade diversion issues. We have SPS and non-tariff barrier liberalization and how these agreements may specifically increase some of the economic gains in Mexico and Japan. And then, of course, we have Ambassador Hill's final question that she just raised. So why don't we take these perhaps in reverse order, since the last one is freshest, and we'll start in reverse order on the panel, and we go to Jim to begin our responses.
Thank you very much. Eric, Carla, yours is the right question. Despite my charisma and persuasiveness, she's right. There is, to my knowledge, absolutely no intention of taking any of these agreements into the WTO. Now, there may come a time when the light will dawn and it will be realized that this needs to happen, but I don't even see a glimmer yet. Now, why will that time come? Did you listen to the ambassador from El Salvador? Recall what I said. Discrimination in favor of some is discrimination against others. There are 2 ways to satisfy him and keep him from suffering from discrimination. One is if the agreement is in the WTO, because if the agreement's in the WTO and El Salvador has some concerns and they're willing to be bound by the concessions in the agreement, they can sign up and they can get the same benefits as Vietnam and everyone else. Assuming the Americans actually do make some concessions on textiles, don't hold your breath. The other way is the answer to Carla's question, which is each of these regional initiatives must be open to others, and not open in a way that says, well, only if we all agree that you can participate, can you get in? I mean, Mexico didn't have any automatic right to participate in the TPP. Japan didn't have any automatic right to participate in the TPP, as has been suggested from the audience. Some people suspect that the United States of America, perish the thought, is trying to circumvent China through the TPP. As I said, if they were proceeding within the WTO, that issue wouldn't even arise. To me, the model of how we should be proceeding to be a broken record is the International Services Agreement that is being negotiated as a plurilateral agreement within the WTO. If we don't take that approach, then we're going to have to answer Carla's question by opening up all of these other agreements to anyone else who wants to participate. I understand the Pacific Alliance has reserved the issue thus far of whether you actually have to be on the Pacific coast in order to be in the Pacific Alliance. You got Uruguay, Paraguay, Spain, a few other people wanting to get in. As Antonio said, if you want to be bound by these rules, you can be. So that's pretty open. But there's not a transparency in how the TPP is going to work. And then I won't even get into the transatlantic deal because it seems to be limited to the United States and the EU. And it poses a lot of the same kinds of questions that the ambassador from El Salvador has just asked, which are going to be asked increasingly by other countries all over the world who are not involved in these negotiations and don't have the opportunities that offer, but are dues-paying members of the WTO and have legal rights as members of the WTO. And eventually will exercise them if they don't get Carlos' question answered in the right way.
Thank you.
Well, so I'm not the official negotiator of the TPP negotiation, so I don't have much I can say right now. But as for the second question, maybe I'd like to quote the joint statement of President Obama, United States and Japan, when President Obama met with Prime Minister Abe, and it said Japan participating in the TPP negotiations, all goods would be subject to negotiation, and Japan would join others in achieving comprehensive, high standard agreement as described, blah, blah, blah. So that is what they said in February. And my personal comment is that we know that the TPP is high standard stuff. That's one of the reasons why it took 3 years for us to make a decision to join TPP. So that's all I can say right now. And the third question, as for the third question, well, I haven't seen that article, so but I suppose that it touched upon our bilateral consultation between Japan and the United States. And when we join to the TPP negotiations, prior to that, we both countries agreed to conduct a bilateral negotiations on auto and several non-tariff barriers. And the first consultation was held in beginning of August, and it still continues. So I can't say anything specific at this moment. But if you have a specific question, please ask me after the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess we're giving the last word to you, Tony.
All right, thank you, Eric. On the, was it ring fencing, or what was the word used? Ring fencing? Yeah, yes. Of some issues in the WTO on whether they could be addressed on a regional basis, I would say yes, they can be addressed, even though it's not very easy. Of course, if you want to negotiate over subsidies to agriculture, then it almost by definition has to be at the WTO. But again, to talk about NAFTA, there was a very, very great deal of agricultural liberalization. It's 3 separate agreements, was not easy, long transition phase for some products, but that was achieved. So my point there is it's difficult, but yes, it can be done. Maybe with one sort of caveat that I would add, and I think issues such as food safety have become more and more important. So I think they have to be kept in mind. It's not only tariffs or anti-dumping. There's this whole food safety issue that has to be kept top of mind if you want to keep agricultural trade flows going. On the issue of textiles, I can't speak to the specifics of the negotiation, but maybe there is a broader point. You mentioned that there's an agreement between Central America and the U.S., and now the U.S. is negotiating the TPP, and that's creating a certain complexity. Well, perhaps the same could be said of TTIP. And I'm happy I can talk about TTIP, even though this is the Asia Pacific, but it's a long way to get to the TTIP.
One more person makes my
Yeah, and well, basically, I just gave some figures about the degree of integration in North America. I mean, North America not only trades with each other, North America produces jointly to sell to each other and to sell to third parties. And if those countries will be deepening their integration through the TPP negotiations, I think would just make eminent sense to take a North American perspective on negotiations with Europe. We know it's difficult. We know it's complex, etc. We've been very, very stubborn about making this point, so I'm being stubborn yet again. And I managed to speak about Europe here on the Asia-Pacific panel.
Good point.
Well, it is a good point, and you know, since we're raising the topic, that's clearly something that we're supportive of too, and you know that, and will continue to be so. One of the issues that arose, and the reason why we actually wanted to put the panel together is for precisely the issue that has come up now in so many ways. But as you're including, for all the right reasons, certain countries, we have to remember in the Latin America context that we've got to keep the doors open to others and not do things that might unnecessarily create economic difficulties for other developing countries in the region. And so our issue, our desire is to see how we can leverage some of these current negotiations as actually a way to regenerate a broader hemispheric trade conversation. Hasten to add, among only those countries that want to participate, that's fine. But there are a lot that want to participate that aren't currently at the table, and we need to find ways to do that. Just a couple very quick points. Thank you again to the IDB and to the ADB. Very meaningful contributions. We congratulate you and thank you. I want to thank again IE Singapore for their meaningful support for the program today, and to encourage any of you who may be in Singapore actually on or about October 2nd, the 10th anniversary of the Asia-Latin American Business Forum will be conducted. There's information out front. It is well worth it. And if you're not there, send your company representatives. There are investors, there are business people from around Asia and from around Latin America. It is a big deal and it's important. And finally, to congratulate Tokyo for the 2020 games decision. And while we're on the whole sporting thing with Cubs and Tokyo and everything else, everybody here in the room knows that I am a big supporter of the U.S.-Mexico relationship, with one very prominent exception.
Oh, no, I didn't want to mention that.
and that, of course, is during the World Cup qualification time. And tonight is a very important game between the United States and Mexico and Columbus. So even though Tony and I are great personal friends, I can only wish luck to the United States in this particular instance. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in thanking the panel for a terrific conversation.